Hi, Simon Anholt. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
How are you finding the Economic Summit so far?
It's very exciting. I wish all the conferences I went to were as exciting as this. It's something to do with the age group.
Fantastic. And your talk was entitled The Good Country Index,
Yeah.
Which you founded.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what the key message you wanted students to take away from your talk today?
I suppose that if I have to choose one key message, it's that it's more important for countries to be good than to be successful. And I have a very specialised definition of what I mean by good. I don't mean good in some vague moral or religious sense. I mean good very concretely as the opposite of selfish. Because my view is that we live in an age of gigantic global crises, which are predominantly caused or enhanced by globalization. All of those crises, whether we're talking about human rights or immigration or climate change, are beyond the power of any individual nation to tackle. Therefore, we must collaborate more and we must cooperate more. The problem, as I see it, is that nations are programmed to compete, and we continue to tell our politicians to compete, and we are all still on this extraordinarily old-fashioned race to be richer and more powerful than other countries. And that's no good, and it's leading us towards disaster. So the single outtake that I wanted people to have was, instead of thinking how can we be more competitive as a nation, how can we be more successful, or even how can we be more happy as a nation, today we should be thinking how can we be more good? What is our contribution to the world?
Fantastic. That's very interesting. And talking about that, you launched this Good Country Index at a TED conference in Berlin in June 2014.
Yeah.
And you did refer to governments as cultural psychopaths.
Yes.
Now, I think, although this is an extreme idea, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts behind it. And if you really do think this is true, how can we possibly reform our entire political system?
I seem to remember actually that the accusation of cultural psychopathy was not merely directed at governments. I think I said, I need to go back and check, but I think I said we're almost all of us cultural psychopaths to one degree or another, or the vast majority of humanity. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, it sounds a little extreme, but as I said, it's rather mild as mental illnesses go.
Although, given that humans, one of their unique traits that we sort of identify is empathy,
Yes.
do you not think that psychopathic behaviour is almost
It's the opposite.
the opposite?
And I think that that is the struggle in humanity, is the cultural psychopathy against the empathy. I think they're both natural tendencies, and I think that they're locked in an eternal struggle. But what I mean by, we know what a psychopath is, okay? I won't give you the clinical definition, but a psychopath is easily recognized because he or she is somebody who has difficulty empathizing with other people. They see the people around them as being somehow two-dimensional, cardboard cutouts. They don't have rich internal lives. And luckily, very few of us are clinically psychopathic. But when it comes to looking at other people from other cultures, other backgrounds, other languages, other skin colors, we have a tendency to see them as being somehow two-dimensional and dealing with them in a somewhat psychopathic way. It is also true, I think, that national politicians are often a bit more like that even than average. I noticed something recently. I was having a meeting with the Prime Minister of a country which will remain nameless, and I didn't speak his language, but I assumed that we were going to be able to speak English, because it's a country where English is widely spoken. And unlike most of his population, he couldn't speak a word of English. So we had an interpreter in the room, and I found myself thinking, I just suddenly realized almost every single senior politician I've ever dealt with has had below average competency in foreign languages. And I thought, someday when I've got some time, I'm going to go and check that out, see whether it's really true or not. My hypothesis is that in order to become a politician, you have to be intensely focused on domestic issues. What I called in the TED talk a mind that microscopes rather than a mind that telescopes.
But do you really think that if someone doesn't know the language of a different country, they're not willing to understand the culture?
Not in every case, but I think it may be a symptom. The sorts of people who take naturally to other languages, who are prepared to put in the time and effort to learn a foreign language, are people who perhaps by definition are slightly more cosmopolitan in their outlook. They're not cultural psychopaths. They think it's worthwhile finding out how people speak in other countries. Whereas if you're one of those extremely domestically focused politicians, you probably just think, why should I care about foreigners and the stupid languages they speak? It's not my business.
I think the idea of a touching point is something you talked about in quite length during your speech, about how We've been brought up with national states and a nationalistic outlook.
Yeah.
But you spoke also about how the EU is something that you've seen as a very noble experiment, demonstrating cooperation.
Yeah.
Given the current situation in Europe, the issues they're having, the challenge of being able to actually achieve this political integration you're talking about having it in 205 member states.
Yes.
Right now we're struggling with 28 EU members. Do you see that as an achievable goal?
First of all, I don't think we're struggling at all. I think that the European Union has been an incredibly successful experiment. You look at the degrees of integration and smooth cooperation that we've managed to achieve in Europe, it's generally much more good than bad. There's a tendency at the moment, because, there was a purely economic issue that we attempted to do monetary union without fiscal union, which I think any first-year economics undergraduate could have told you was likely to be problematic. But I don't think that's the issue. I think that's peripheral. What's really significant is the fact that to a very, very remarkable degree, these 28 countries work together and they solve their problems together. And it's no accident the European Union is more successful and more prosperous than any other collection of countries on the planet. And I think that there's a dangerous risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy here, that we have such high expectations of Europe that if something relatively trivial goes wrong, we immediately assume the whole thing is failing. It is not failing. And the world needs more Europes.
But what I would actually like to go into actually a bit further into that, you say that this is an economic crisis that we're seeing, which it obviously is, but some of the talks we've heard earlier today have said that the reason for this economic problems is the lack of political integration in the EU, the fact that we haven't actually been able to achieve that, the fact that there's these member states who actually are fighting for themselves and not for the whole. So I'm just trying to picture in how we will get the whole world, in effect, to cooperate. And how would you like to see that happen in practice, perhaps? That would be the best way to put it.
Well, baby steps. History teaches us that humanity progresses by very, very small degrees and frequently takes several large steps backwards before it takes a small step forwards. So I think that experiments like Europe are a very, very important stage in the path towards a necessary state of global cooperation. I am not talking about a global superstate here, and I'm not even necessarily saying that it's right for everybody, or indeed even right for Europe, to have full political integration. I think that these are organizational issues. What I'm more interested in is the simple matter of nations gradually getting to the stage where they push up the sliders on cooperation and collaboration and pull down the sliders a little bit on competition. The precise form that takes is always going to be different depending on the countries that you're talking about. But I think that you're absolutely right. Europe is going through a very, very difficult patch at the moment. And there is a lot of infighting between countries, and one of the biggest issues in Europe, one that's very seldom mentioned, is the fact that it sells itself very badly. And that's too easy. Because unfortunately what domestic politicians in Europe tend to do, and it's too easy for them to do it, is that for domestic political purposes they blame the European Union for everything bad that happens and they take personal credit for everything good that the EU does. And that is a catch-22 situation. Until we can figure out a solution to that, I think we're probably not going to advance much further. But as I say, those issues are all peripheral. Europe hasn't won the battle yet. We are by no means a perfectly successful experiment, but we've made much, much more progress than any group of nations has done before in human history. And I want to see the next experiments get started. I want to see South America doing this. They could do it much more easily than Europe because they don't have the linguistic problems that we had to face, which are gigantic and serious. I'd like to see the Gulf Cooperation Council stepping up cooperation in Gulf states. I'd like to see the African Union taking a more proactive role and trying to dream other different ways. It doesn't have to be on the EU model, of course, that would be absurd.
Yeah, but what I'd like to, I'll take you back to your Good Country Index. You're asking, it's a call for countries to be more good. You're saying that to do well, you need to do good, which is, of course, a logical thing. But when it comes down to it, how can countries improve their global image? Is it something that can be changed, societal perspective?
Okay, this has got nothing to do with image, nothing whatsoever.
Okay.
I couldn't give a damn about their image. It may well be that one of the motivations for a government to want to be more good is because they believe that that will improve their image. And they'd probably be right, although it takes rather a long time. So the connection with image is entirely incidental. It's simply, that's the story of
It's
how
a
I got to
motivation.
it. It's a motivation. In my career, I found it to be quite a useful one, because governments may not care too much about humanity. They may not even care enough about humanity to want to learn English, but they certainly care about prosperity for their own population and their own nation. So what I've been able to prove is a very simple two-part argument. One, if you want to be more competitive, if you want to make more money out of the foreigners as tourists or as investors or what have you, then you need a better image. And the only way that you can improve your image is not by stupid propaganda bragging about how wonderful you are, because it patently doesn't work. I've proved that it doesn't work. The only way you can improve your image is by making people feel glad that you exist. Yeah? People around the world feel glad that your country exists because of the good you do for humanity. That will improve your image, and the improved image will improve your trade, and therefore you will make more money. That's a motivation. But in the end, I think the main motivation for politicians is the populations must demand it of them. In the end, I, as a citizen of the United Kingdom, want to be able to travel around the world with my head held up high. I want people to say to me, ooh, you're from the UK, we like the UK, because of what you're doing. Not because you're invading other countries, not because you're stealing money from other countries by buying their goods cheaply and then selling them at a profit, but because you're actually combating climate change, you're combating human trafficking, you're doing something for women's rights. Those kinds of things. I want my country to be liked. And if I and 58 million other people go to hammering on David Cameron's door, and we say to him, it is more important to us that we should be admired, that people should feel glad that the United Kingdom exists, than that we should be able to make money out of them, then maybe he'll change.
So this brings us on to the point that I think your viewpoint is strongly that public opinion is the power that's going to drive this whole change that you're talking about. And so we've had a lot of questions today at the summit about how people can get more involved in this, how people can, put their faith behind this idea of a good country index, and that good countries are the ones that are going to come out the winners. So how can people?
Well, the first thing they can do is to join the party. The Good Country Party, which I sort of pre-launched in November, it hasn't really got off the ground yet because I haven't been able to spend enough time on it. I'm doing 9 things at the same time at the moment. But the Good Country Party is basically a place where all the naturally cosmopolitan people in the world, and I've estimated there are about 700 million of them, that's my starting number, can join. I'm deliberately not setting the agenda. I don't come into this as a politician with a programme and an ideology that I want to impose.
So to clarify, it's not a political party?
Well, it's a sort of a political party in the sense that we are talking about things that could be described as politics. It's not a political party in the sense that it can't stand for election anywhere, because it doesn't exist in any country. It exists in the gaps between countries. I said when I launched it at TEDx Amsterdam in November that I was trying to rent some space on the International Space Station for our headquarters. This proved to be problematic, but we'll find somewhere eventually. The point is that it's a political party in the sense that a large number of friends, 700 million friends, are going to go to the same place and stand around having drinks and conversations together. In that sense, it's a party, the kind of party everybody would like to go to. And I don't want to say in advance what we're going to do or how we're going to do it, because I think that those 700 million natural cosmopolitans need to have a big discussion together where we decide what we're going to do and how we're going to push everybody else gently towards our way of seeing things.
But I'm correct in saying that the idea behind the whole party is to tackle these big global problems that you've mentioned.
Yes.
And so in practice, it would be looking at ways to do so.
We'll be looking at ways to do so through the national domestic politics, because I believe that most of the power in the world is held by national governments and by corporations. So this is a message as much to the people working for companies who want to talk to their company bosses as it is for people living in countries who want to talk to their national leaders. Yeah.
Do you not think that you'll find a challenge in reconciling domestic policy with these big international agenda?
Do you know, in a way, that's the $64,000 question, and the reason that I feel able to present this now is because the last 15 years of my life I've been advising governments on basically domestic and international policy. And my finding, it's not revolutionary, is that all political decisions are made easier if you see them in the international context. Far from there being a conflict between domestic and international agendas. Sometimes there are, of course. I mean, but then again, you're going to have conflicts between making policy for London and making policy for Birmingham. That's policy.
There's disparity everywhere.
Politics is about resolving conflicts. But I have never seen, and this is one of the things I said in my TED talk in Berlin, I've never seen a piece of domestic policy that could not be tackled more imaginatively and more effectively than by treating it as an international issue. At the most basic level, simply benchmarking what you're doing against what other countries have done in the past, that's the most basic, most idiotic form of it. That's a valuable thing to do. And surprisingly few governments do that. So, you know, where do we build our hospital? Do we build it in town or do we build it outside town? Now, you might think you couldn't get more domestic than that, but it's extraordinary how few politicians would do a little scout round and see what other countries have done. So at that most basic level, just learning from other countries, and then you can graduate up through different layers of good countryness to full cooperation and collaboration, where you're working together and sharing the benefits.
When do you see that milestone? Do you see it in the near future, in the next 20 years, in the next 50 years? Or is it somewhere really, you know, that you just can't predict?
I see it in pieces all around me. I see the components of it just lying around waiting to be assembled. Every day I pick up a newspaper and I see some example or other of a country doing exactly the right things. It's just at the moment that it's not coalescing into a recognized approach, a recognized ideology. So it's not taking shape. These things sometimes cluster together and then they fall apart again. I was in Dubai the day before yesterday, and I learnt about an initiative which the government of the United Arab Emirates had put together, which is called Drones for Good. And it's an award that they make every year for the most praiseworthy use of unmanned aerial vehicles for non-military, non-combat purposes. And I clapped my hands in glee when I heard about that, and I thought, that is classic good country behaviour. Every day I see something like that. All that needs to happen is that it needs to be assembled into a coherent message, that people understand this is the way we need to be.
And that is what the Good Country article is for.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us, Sam.
Pleasure.
Thanks.